Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello to everyone here in London. Hello to the hundreds of people watching us online. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this event this morning. Each and every year we produce our Green Budget, which is our look at the challenges and choices available to the Chancellor. We've been releasing chapters of that Green Budget over the recent weeks, but today we've published the final few chapters looking at the outlook for the economy and the public finances. It's a huge amount of work behind the scenes. It's always good to have it out of the door and to be able to share it with all of you. Before I hand to our main speakers for this morning, I wanted to highlight just one theme that I think cuts across the work that we're publishing today, and it's that Rachel Reeves has choices. She is not merely at the mercy of external events and constraints. I think it's worth remembering back to before the election, Rachel Reeves was very keen to stress that she didn't want to raise taxes or plan to raise taxes. Of course, we all know that her first budget, she did raise taxes before quickly saying that she didn't plan to do that again. I suspect, therefore, this year will feel like Groundhog Day for Rachel Reeves because tax rises are very much on the table once again. And that is, to a very large degree, a situation of her own making. It is absolutely true that she had a dire inheritance from the previous government. It is also true the UK has a long-running problem with weak productivity growth, and that predates the Chancellor's time in office. It's also true that changes in the world haven't been helpful for Rachel Reeves. And of course, nobody wants to be the Chancellor holding the public finances when the OBR downgrades a forecast. But the Chancellor would absolutely have known last year, when she chose to give herself teeny-tiny headroom against her fiscal rules, that it was perfectly possible that completely ordinary, completely run-of-the-mill changes to forecasts would blow her off course. She would also, of course, have known that the OBR were a relatively optimistic forecaster compared to others. And of course, she couldn't have possibly foreseen exactly what would happen in the world, but I think it's reasonable to expect that she would have known that something could have happened that would have made the public finances worse rather than better. And for all those reasons, that's why I'm saying that looking at why we're facing today a fiscal consolidation, which I think what most people, including us, expect Rachel Reeves to need to do, why we're here at that point in time, that's largely because that she made that choice last year to give herself this very small wiggle room against her fiscal rules. And as we look forward to that fiscal consolidation, or look ahead as opposed to forward, but look ahead to that fiscal consolidation, I think it's worth saying that she does have a really important set of choices, not only about how big to make the consolidation, how to do it, but other choices too. I'm looking forward to discussing those choices today. So let me stop there to make sure we have lots of other time for everyone else's presentations. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers up front and then let them come up one at a time. I'll then pop back at the end of that to do some discussion with the panel and to take your questions. So after this, you are going to hear first from Mark Franks, who is Director of Welfare at the Nuffield Foundation. Nuffield have been kindly helping to fund the Green Budget for a number of years now, so thank you very much to Mark and to Nuffield. You're then going to hear from Jack Meaning, who is UK Chief Economist at Barclays. Barclays are a new partner this year, who have also contributed some funding and who have contributed chapters on the macroeconomic outlook. So Jack's going to share the highlights of those with you, so thank you to Jack and Barclays. You'll then hear from Nick Ridpath, who is an economist with us at the IFS, and he'll present our analysis of the UK public finances. We're then going to hear from Jonathan Haskell, who is currently Professor of Economics at Imperial Business School, but who was previously a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee from 2018 to 2024, and then from Andy King, who is now a Specialist Partner at Flint Global, but was previously a member of the OBR's Budget Responsibility Committee from 2018 to 2023. So Jonathan and Andy are perfectly well placed to talk about the big policy decisions coming up, and I'm grateful for both of them for sharing their time and thoughts with us today, so thank you. We should finish all of that at about 10:30, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion. We'll take questions here in the audience in London, but for those of you listening online, I'm going to be looking at the Slido as well, so you can pop your questions into Slido. I know there are hundreds and hundreds of you watching, so do vote for the questions that you would most like to see the answer to, and I will try to weave those as best I can into the discussion. But for now, let me stop there and hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and good morning to everybody here and attending online. It may be that you'll hear similar points made in slightly different ways by different people this morning, which is one of the advantages of speaking relatively early. But I will keep it brief because I know you'll be keen to get on to the the meat of the report and the content of the presentation. But I did want to say a little about the Nuffield Foundation and our motivation for supporting this work, and to offer a few observations on this year's Green Budget. So the Nuffield Foundation is independent, and we fund and undertake rigorous research, encouraging innovation and supporting use of sound evidence to improve people's lives. We aim to tackle pressing complex questions and address the inequalities, disadvantage, discrimination and vulnerabilities that people face. And among our interests, how we can build a society that's prosperous and fair, but also where people are secure and can fulfil their potential. And that's why we have proudly supported the Green Budget for many years. On each occasion, the IFS has provided rigorous, independent analysis of the UK's public finances and the economic choices facing the government. And this year, I'm delighted by the new collaboration with Barclays, and I want to thank them for their major contribution to this year's report. You'll be hearing today about the economic and fiscal big picture, and how at the forthcoming budget we face what is likely to be a particularly difficult readjustment to stay within the fiscal rules. But each Green Budget also provides detailed analysis of specific topics which have been pre-released in advanced chapters over the last few weeks. And I'd like to make a few brief remarks based on those. An underlying theme was about ensuring efficiency and best value from public spending. The IFS looked closely this year at the implications of spending more of our national income on defence. And some of the most difficult decisions about how to do this have been deferred to future years, which does help with the fiscal arithmetic in the short term. However, it may not achieve the best value for money from the investment in terms of improved defence capabilities, which is ultimately what it's supposed to be all about. The chapter on supporting and funding children with additional needs showed the system is fragmented and hasn't kept pace with the changing needs of the population. And there's a compelling case for holistic review of these services to ensure resources are being directed to where the need is the greatest. Another area looked at this year, which is ripe for reform, is unemployment insurance, where there are options both for strengthening the support for the recently unemployed whilst potentially reducing the overall welfare bill. So what's not to like? However, this needs to be done without pulling the rug from under existing long-term candidates with health claimants with health conditions, by thinking carefully about the design and delivery of transitional support for those who would lose out. And another key route to better value for money highlighted this year was improved public sector productivity. This is less of an option and more of a necessity, as it's extremely hard to see how we'll be able to meet future demand for public health care without it, in addition to other pressures that come from the changing demographic and social circumstances of the UK. Yet successive governments have struggled to make progress on public sector productivity, and lasting improvements will only come through rethinking how public services operate in a quite fundamental way, rather than looking for quick fixes around issues such as public sector pay. So one clear message out of all of this is that quick and easy wins are hard to find. And it's far easier to point out where things are not right than it is for the government to put them right. Nevertheless, some clear messages do come through. One is to think long-term and strategically, rather than relying on short-term and unsustainable fixes. And the second is to avoid making things worse. And the constrained environment we find ourselves in means that the IFS have highlighted the real risk of turning to tax measures that complicate the system and distort incentives. And that temptation must be avoided. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the IFS team. The Green Budget is a publication that matters in our national conversation, and we would be poorer without it. It plays a vital role in scrutinising government decisions, informing stakeholders across politics, media and civil society, and promoting transparency and accountability. And this purpose is as vital in today's world as it ever has been. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'd like to start by thanking Helen and the whole team at the IFS. It's an absolute pleasure for me and for Barclays to be able to have partnered with the IFS this year on the Green Budget. Barclays is a UK bank that's been part of the UK economy for 3 centuries now and has a global view on markets. But when it comes to kind of independent, rigorous expertise on fiscal policy and with a real UK focus, the IFS is unrivaled, and it's a real honour for us to have been able to contribute to this. Onto the economics, and as we've already heard from Helen and from Mark, the economic backdrop that the Chancellor is facing as we go into this budget is a difficult one. We are seeing that growth has decelerated. We saw more evidence of that this morning. We are seeing the unemployment rate rise and has been on an upward trajectory. We think actually one that is looser than the official data would have you believe. And we are seeing, even with that, inflation staying notably higher than the Bank of England's target, which means that interest rates have had to stay in restrictive territory. Our view across our 5-year forecast is that in the near term, we expect this softening of the economy to continue. So we think that the second half of this year will see GDP growth to be half of what it was in the first half. Partly that is a story of the savings rate remaining high, which weighs on consumption as uncertainty holds back household spending decisions, even with real income growth. But also it's as the unemployment rate rises and businesses lack confidence in an uncertain background, and, as we've discussed, the impending fiscal consolidation, which seems to have been penciled in by just about everyone at this stage. However, that very near-term look gives way to a cyclical pickup, in our view, as we move through into 2026 and 27. So our assessment of the current inflation dynamics are that they are driven by largely temporary forces, price level shocks rather than persistent inflation shocks. And as they drop out, assuming no change in inflationary measures at the budget, this should allow inflation to drop back to 2% relatively quickly over the start of next year and allow the Bank of England to continue moving interest rates down, leading to policy no longer being restrictive. We think in the medium term, we'll see growth pick up to just under 1.5%, which is in line with where we estimate the UK's potential will get to as we see total factor productivity picking up. But all of that medium-term outlook requires 3 particular things to happen. First of all, we need a handover from what has driven growth recently, which has been the public sector and the net trade position, to private domestic demand, so households consumption and business investment. We also need to see a pickup in productivity, and this is perhaps the most central element to our forecast, is that productivity growth is expected to strengthen, not as much as the OBR expected in its March EFO, but certainly from where it is now. And we also need an ability of policymakers to navigate this transition. We called the chapter the narrow path, or navigating narrow paths, and we think that is basically the transition here from this cyclical near-term softness to a more sustainable growth model over the medium term. Now, with those 3 things, the chapter explores scenarios that are relevant to each of them. So the first we explore is an inflationary budget. Our view is that actually the Chancellor would be well advised to opt for policies that make the consolidation that's required through measures that are non-inflationary and where possible disinflationary. But if we were to see measures such as a VAT increase or increases on duty on sin taxes, then our modelling would suggest that that would both keep monetary and fiscal policy restrictive and worsen macro outcomes. So you would see double the hit to GDP compared to the same consolidation if you went through levers that were non-inflationary. We would also see the unemployment rate peak 0.2 percentage points higher, so a worse outcome in the labour market, and overall cost to households and businesses. We expect the savings rate, as I said, to remain relatively elevated, and our modelling suggests that it will only come down to around 9% in the medium term, but that's significantly slower than the OBR expected back in March, and a more rapid easing would actually boost consumption in the medium term, the level of consumption by 2%. So that's a possible upside if we were to see this deceleration of savings. And then the last thing we investigate in the chapter is what happens if the OBR is right on productivity. So we have a more pessimistic view of medium-term productivity growth. I think most people that do my job across financial markets have that more pessimistic view. But if we were wrong and the OBR were right, then we think that actually the level of real GDP by the time we get to 2030 could be as much as 2% higher. This gives you the broad contours of our GDP outlook. And as you can see, that cyclical pickup as we move through the second half of 26 into 27 creates a bump. But notably across us and other forecasters is the medium-term difference to the OBR, where we are just shy of 1.5%. The OBR much closer to 1.8, 1.9% in the medium run. And that comes down to the productivity assessment. As I said, there's a key question here about what happens to savings, and that's what's going to drive the ability of the private sector to step into what will be slowing public spending and a slowing global economy. You can see from the swathe here, our modelling would suggest that actually there's a relatively slow reduction in the saving rate, which is what's weighing on household consumption across our forecast. It only provides a mild boost. But that purple line is the OBR's assumption, which is actually by the end outside of the swathe implied by our models. You can see if we move from that blue line, which we assume, to the OBR's line in the purple, that would be a level difference of 2% in households consumption, which is, you know, when we're talking about household consumption growth of less than 2% a year, that's a significant amount. Our assessment on the labour market, as I said, is that it is loose and probably looser than a lot of official data would have you think. This is employment changes since March 2024. And you can see if you were to take the labour force survey at face value, you would have added almost 900,000 jobs since then. We have a whole range of other indicators that we use, and they all suggest that actually over the same period, employment has been flat to contracting, which suggests that actually there is less strength in job creation and in the job market than maybe you would think otherwise. This is important because it leads to slack, and it's a key part of what will drive the ability of inflation to come back to target and allow the easing of monetary policy, which is able to offset the continued drag from fiscal policy. Now, one of the risks to this outlook is that we would see, and Jonathan and others have done work to show that there is a phenomenon of households and workers trying to catch up previously lost real earnings. What we show here on the right-hand side is that actually if you take a trend of up to the start of COVID of real earnings and you play that forward, actually in total pay and regular pay, we're seeing households have recovered to where they would have expected to be given historic trends. So in our view, the risk of catch-up at this point is relatively limited. And we think that that means we've got more confidence in this more medium-term view of inflation coming back to target. As we move into the medium term, we think productivity growth will allow real wage growth to kick in and be sustainable, even with inflation at 2%. As I said, all of that brings inflation back to target in the medium term. And you can see here the CPI rate comes back and is pretty stable at 2%. One of the reasons we think this is possible is because the current high inflation we have on our assessment has been very much driven by the tax changes and the policy changes the Chancellor made at October's budget last year and administered prices, which have been partly a result of policy. So you can see here on the right-hand side the current increase in CPI inflation as we rise up towards 4%. But if you strip out the tax changes that we saw in October's budget, so increases in alcohol and tobacco duties, increases in national insurance and the extent to which they've been passed on, increases in VAT on private school fees. When you strip all of those out, you actually get to a number which is much closer to 3% now than 4%. And if you further strip out the impact of administered prices, you get to something which is actually even lower. And so we think that these things, if they're not repeated in this coming November's budget, at least to the same extent, then there will be a really large base effect and disinflation coming through. But that's a crucial assumption, is that we don't see a repeat of that in this November's budget. And so we run some scenarios in the chapter where we look at what would happen if the same consolidation that we assume happens in a non-inflationary way were to happen through levers that just temporarily pushed up inflation. And you can see here we assume a VAT increase, but this is a proxy. This could be, other duties on alcohol and tobacco. It could be anything that mechanically raises the price level. And what you can see is ordinarily, you would have that spike. The yellow line is higher than the blue. And policymakers, such as those at the Bank of England, would look through that knowing it's a temporary increase. And you would have a mild pull down in GDP, and the temporary shock would pass through. What our modelling suggests is actually rules that are more akin to what we think is the reaction function now, where the central bank worried about inflation already at 4%, much more focused on spot current inflation today rather than inflation in 2 years' time. They would suggest, as you can see by the right-hand side, that shows how much higher or lower rates should be given this shock. They would imply that you would have about half a percentage point more in interest rates. They would be higher by half a percentage point in order to deal with this near-term inflation, even though in theory it's temporary. And when you play that through, here's what it means for output in the economy and unemployment. The green line is assuming a consolidation that happens in a non-inflationary way. That still has a hit to GDP, but it's about 0.25% at its peak. And the unemployment rate, rather than peaking at 5.1, peaks at, actually to the rounding, probably still 5.1%. However, that same consolidation through inflationary means sees almost 0.5% of GDP hit at peak, and inflation rate ticking up to 5.3%. So that's a more material hit to the economy for the same effective fiscal consolidation. And the point I'd want everyone to leave today with is that this is a crucial choice. As Helen talked about choices the Chancellor has, this is a crucial choice about a consolidation is required to meet the fiscal rules, but exactly how it's met, not all levers are created equal. The next question is just to illustrate exactly what a difference productivity makes. So here is a decomposition of our productivity forecast. You can see that the yellow lines, which are labour's input, they have been pretty strong this year as we've seen large net migration into the UK. That is expected to slow. The natural demographics of the UK are not adding to this. This is all about the extent of net inward migration, keeping those yellow bars positive but much diminished from recent history. There's some capital deepening as firms pick up investment and increase the amount of capital they have per worker. But actually, the big switch from negative to positive comes from total factor productivity, the extent to which we can effectively combine those inputs. And we expect it to go from negative about 0.3 at the moment up to roughly up to positive 0.4 by the time we get to the end of this forecast. And that enables increases in real GDP that increase standards of living. Now, the OBR had in its March outlook a much more aggressive increase in productivity. Rather than averaging, as we do, a kind of a shift from minus 0.3 to plus 0.4, they had this peaking at 1% by the same time horizon. If you were to see what difference that makes, if they're right and we are wrong, then we would move from our green line for real GDP to that yellow line. So you can see this is a change that makes a dramatic impact on the level and the size of the economy. So we would assess that actually the economy would be roughly 2% larger if they are right on productivity. The converse being, obviously, if we are right, their forecast at the end of it is 2% of GDP out. And we are expecting them to signal that they're going to downgrade their productivity assessment. Our baseline is conditioned on a view that they take 0.1 percentage points off. So of the roughly 0.5 percentage points difference between us and them, we think they come around a fifth of the way. I think there's briefing that maybe the risk of that could be a little bit more of a downgrade. So that would close some of that gap. I just want to finish very quickly with a nod to the thematic chapter that my colleague Moeen Islam has written, looking at the markets focus. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on at Barclays is our ability to plug into what's going on in the markets, both in the UK and globally. And Moeen has written an incredible chapter basically looking at why the market is so focused here, because this is a real touch point, this budget, for the market, and exactly what the underlying fundamentals might mean. Now, the framing of that is actually the UK's underlying fiscal fundamentals in terms of deficits, in terms of debt to GDP, are not out of line with our peers. But we have had a shift in the supply makeup. So you can see here, these green bars are the combination of new debt being issued and the Bank of England's QT programme, raising the amount of debt that we're expecting the market to absorb at a time when the demand balance and the demand structure of the investors in that bond market has shifted. So we have had a reduction in the demand of investors at the longer end and a shift in the composition. And that means now the Chancellor is having to make all of those changes I just discussed on the macroeconomic side against the backdrop of a market where investors are a bit more sensitive to what's going on in terms of quantities and prices of that debt. And that means that what is really required in order to keep markets on side and in order to make sure that we don't see a world in which they tighten interest rates and worsen the Chancellor's predicament, what is needed is a credible plan that convinces the market, can actually yield benefits of bringing rates down, which actually reduces the problem that the Chancellor faces, and stops us doing what we have done in kind of recent budgets, which is basically tick over, get just enough headroom to get through this event, and then have to be in exactly the same position in 6 to 12 months' time, but with fewer levers to pull. Something that is credible and convinces the market, whilst also keeping growth and the macro backdrop I've described, can achieve that and actually will yield benefits, but the risk is obviously that we don't. That's not what we see. Let me stop there and pass on.
Thanks very much, Jack. I'm now going to talk a little bit about what this will mean for the public finances going forward. So, to join a sort of long line of presenters, Rachel Reeves faces significant challenges at the budget next month. Not least amongst these is the really narrow margin she's left herself in headroom against both of her fiscal rules. Now, the really limited amount of headroom she's working with is particularly important, given that, as we've said, the OBR is widely expected to downgrade its productivity forecast next month. This will mean higher expected borrowing over the next few years, which is likely to eat into or completely erase the margin she has against these fiscal rules. Now, of course, there are other challenges she's facing, not least that debt interest spending is twice what it was prior to the pandemic, and this has been relatively unexpected. It's £64 billion higher than it was forecast to be just 3 years ago. Now, there's a number of other challenges as well that she's facing, not least additional pressures on defence spending, public service delivery plans, uncertainty about tax revenue. Many of these are covered in other chapters of the Green Budget we're launching today. But to return to the budget next month, one key thing the Chancellor will be aiming for is to be running a forecast current budget surplus in 2029-30. Back in March, she was meeting this with around £10 billion of headroom, but since then, already £6 billion of this has been wiped out by reversals and U-turns on social security policy. Here we're talking both about the reforms to winter fuel allowance and to personal independence payments. In addition to this, since March, we've also seen the interest rates the government pays on its debt, gilt yields, and expectations for gilt yields going forward increasing, and this will push up the government's borrowing costs over the next few years as well. And we estimate that will do that by another £5 billion or so. And what that means is even before you get into questions about what the OBR will forecast productivity to be or what will happen elsewhere in the economy, the Chancellor's headroom against this borrowing fiscal rule may well have already been wiped out. When we're thinking about this productivity forecast and what we think might happen to the economy, we use scenarios provided by Barclays that Jack's just told us about. We estimate that plugging their numbers in for the economy will leave the Chancellor will lead to an additional £11 billion of borrowing by 2029-30. This is mostly driven by, as Jack said, a lower assumption of what productivity will be, although there's also some things going on with higher inflation and what that means for spending as well. Overall, this means the government can expect to be borrowing without making any other changes, £22 billion more by 2029-30 than they were forecast to back in March. And there's two things I noteworthy about this. First, I want to emphasise that what will really matter for this is what the OBR says. We're using Barclays modelling. The specificities of what they forecast will make a bit of a difference. It may be their number comes out lower or higher, but we think this is a good guide for the kind of magnitude of total extra borrowing we can be expecting. And it's also worth noting that this total extra borrowing is not particularly extraordinary. Over the last 15 years, we estimate in the chapter that this kind of borrowing increase has happened about once every 2 years. So while it is a problem and something that needs to be dealt with, it's not something that would have been unreasonable for the Chancellor to plan for. And overall, what this means is to meet this borrowing fiscal rule, the Chancellor will need at least £12 billion of fiscal consolidation just to meet the fiscal rule. Now, of course, this isn't Rachel Reeves' only fiscal rule. She also has a so-called debt rule, which is to have debt as measured by public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNUFL, falling as a share of national income by 2029 at 30. Now, back in March, she was meeting this rule by a pretty narrow margin as well, around 15 billion. But what we can see when we plug in Barclays numbers is that she's no longer meeting this rule and is missing it by around 17 billion. Now, it's particularly noteworthy that this is a bigger gap than she has than to the other fiscal rule, which was previously the one that was binding. This is because the debt rule and the margin against the debt rule is particularly influenced by what we think growth is going to be going forward. And if we see a downgrade in growth, we think that this debt rule is going to be much more likely to be the kind of binding fiscal rule. And if it is, this means that even if the Chancellor does do £12 billion of fiscal consolidation, and that keeps her within the margins of this borrowing rule, she'd need at least an additional £5 billion under this scenario to meet both of her fiscal rules, to meet the debt rule as well. Now, when we think about the debt rule, we can start thinking also about changes to capital expenditure, either cuts or reprofiling, as capital expenditure falls under the debt rule but not under the borrowing rule in its current form. But this means that, broadly, the picture is that if the debt rule binds, we may be looking at an even larger fiscal consolidation than we might otherwise need to be looking at. But in either case, a key takeaway from this is that for the second fiscal event in a row, the Chancellor is going to be forced into making sort of a fiscal tightening just to meet the letter of her fiscal rules. And this could be thought to be creating quite significant amounts of kind of policy volatility that we might think is unhelpful. It can lead to policy kind of being rushed through or put together without a kind of long-term strategy. And as we've seen over the last 6 months to a year, it can create quite damaging speculation. There's been a lot of discussion about which taxes might go up or which spending might be cut. And this is particularly difficult for those who are trying to plan decisions around what the government might do. So one way, and one thing that we might think was driving this policy volatility is the really small amount of headroom the Chancellor has been leaving herself at each of her fiscal events. Both in March and back last October, she left herself around 0.3% of GDP in headroom against her fiscal rules. Now, this is pretty similar to what her predecessor, Sir Jeremy Hunt, did in each fiscal event when he was Chancellor. But if we go back a little further, we can see that both of them were quite far outside the norm for what governments were doing. Every other fiscal event run by a Chancellor left around 0.5 to 1.5% of GDP in headroom, with a couple of exceptions. And we do some work in the chapter to sort of think about if the Chancellor were to return to the kind of level of headroom that was normal prior to 2022, what that would mean for the chance of us kind of all being back again here in 6 months, discussing which fiscal consolidation she'd need. And we find that moving back to this kind of level of headroom would substantially reduce the likelihood that we would need to do more fiscal consolidation in the spring to stay within her fiscal rules. Now, of course, building additional headroom isn't necessarily straightforward. It's not costless. It involves significantly higher spending cuts or tax rises than the government would otherwise need to do just to meet the fiscal rules by a whisker. But we do find evidence that this is likely to significantly reduce the kind of policy volatility we've been seeing in recent years. There's also other things the Chancellor could do to the fiscal framework to prevent this kind of volatility and prevent more changes in the spring. There's been discussion about kind of moving to one OBR forecast per year and introduction of a range. I think we'll get into more of that. We can get into more of that in the Q&A. But in either case, whether just to stay within her fiscal rules or to build more headroom on top of that, the Chancellor is likely to have to reduce borrowing at the budget. Now, there are two ways she can do this, of course. The first would be with spending cuts. These are certainly possible, but there's reason to think it would be difficult, particularly on the kind of scale of savings she's going to be making, to do this entirely through spending cuts. Reasons to think this: first, we've already seen over the course of the last year that the Chancellor's attempts to cut social security spending so far have been far from fully successful. And then when we think about departmental spending, this was officially settled up to 2028-29 in the spending review in June. Now, the Chancellor could reopen this, but given that it's so soon afterwards, we might think that would be particularly difficult. Of course, the fiscal rules bind in 2029-30, not in 28-29, and that year is not covered by the spending review. So the Chancellor could do some sort of trickery where we have unspecified spending cuts coming in 2029-30, but I think it's pretty clear that those would lack credibility and there would be very little holding Rachel Reeves to stick to those cuts going forward. So while it might meet the letter of the fiscal rules, it certainly wouldn't meet the spirit of them. So given this, we might think that tax rises are likely. We can come onto this a bit more when some of the authors of the chapter of the Green Budget on taxes will be able to talk in the Q&A. But there's been a lot of focus on tax rises on the compatibility with manifesto pledges. And what we really discuss in the chapter in the Green Budget is that the wider economic effects of taxes are really important too, and they need a lot of consideration. And put kind of broadly, meaningful reform to the tax system could lighten the economic burden of higher taxes and make the system fairer, simpler, and less damaging to growth. But all in all, the key point to take away from this, and the most simple point to take away from this, is that meeting the government's fiscal rules is likely to require a significant fiscal consolidation. Now, this leaves three key choices for Rachel Reeves. First, should this fiscal consolidation come in the form of spending cuts, tax rises, or both? There's reason to think that both spending cuts and many different types of tax rises are politically difficult, and it's really important, as Jack and Helen have both already said, to think about the kind of economic consequences of the choices she makes. Second, if she's making this fiscal consolidation, how large should it be? Should it be just large enough to meet the fiscal rules with no margin at all, or should she build up a more significant buffer than she has built up at past fiscal events? This might help her prevent the kind of policy volatility we've seen and prevent the government from sort of limping from fiscal event to fiscal event, trying to find more money each time. And then third and finally, there's a question of even if she does or if she doesn't implement this kind of larger fiscal consolidation and build up more headroom, there's a question of whether there's value of kind of adjusting the fiscal framework in other ways. Perhaps we're going to one forecast per year. This would be a relatively blunt instrument, as it would mean, by definition, the Chancellor wouldn't be missing her fiscal rules in spring because there'll be no forecast to miss them against. But this, or maybe other issues like sort of bringing forward or expanding the use of ranges when thinking about the fiscal framework, could be valuable. With that, I will hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks very much indeed, and good morning, everybody, and thank you to the IFS for organising this terrific event. Let me start by, I want to make three broad points. Let me start by, I'm afraid, agreeing and emphasising a lot of what you've heard just now from Nick and from Jack, Mark, and indeed from Helen, which is regarding the headroom. It seems to me that we just simply cannot go on like this. The thought, Nick, of you just mentioning another event in 6 months' time where because of the minimal headroom, the government has just missed the amount of headroom. I mean, I'm delighted to come and speak to everybody, and it's lovely to see, familiar faces in the crowd. So it would be lovely to see everybody. But of course, firms and consumers aren't stupid. So the attendant uncertainty around some tax increase that might go up or some other tax increase that might go down would just be ruinous for the economy. So may I just strongly agree with what the speakers have said, and I think it underlines the urgency of sorting all of this out, and this event is orientated to do precisely that. So let me say two things. One, I'm going to be pessimistic, and the other, I'm going to be optimistic. On interest rates, I'm afraid I'm more pessimistic than you heard from Jack. I think that the evidence suggests that inflationary forces in the UK are much more sticky than we think. We had a little bit of a flavour of this in the IMS World Economic Outlook yesterday, where, as you know, inflation is forecast to be relatively much higher in the UK than elsewhere. Where does that sticky inflation come from? The sticky inflation comes from the deteriorating labour market. Where does the deteriorating labour market come from? Again, as you heard from all the speakers, the Chancellor has made choices. The choice to increase the national insurance contributions at the lower level, along with a more than expected increase in the minimum wage, has essentially raised the natural rate of unemployment because it's just increased extra costs upon firms, and firms are having to pass all those extra costs on without being able to make savings elsewhere. That's raised inflationary pressure in the economy. So I would differ slightly with the outlook, and I'm afraid this is pessimistic, therefore, in terms of borrowing costs, in that I expect fewer interest rate cuts. So that's the pessimistic bit. The last point I want to make is, hooray, a bit of optimism. And the optimism is around productivity. Now, as you heard from Jack, productivity has been a terrible, terrible story in the UK over the last few years. In particular, our total factor productivity growth, that is to say, the efficiency with which we use with which we perform our productive activities, the efficiency with which workers use capital, and so forth, that's been miserable. It's been either zero or negative in contrast to other places. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. The first thing is, we have in the UK, which messes up the data, a very large, what I would call a resource sector. So in the North Sea, because we're running out of North Sea and because of the decisions we've made about fracking, there is enormous measured negative total factor productivity growth there. And that brings down productivity growth in the whole economy by a very long way, along also, I should say, with gas and water. That's because of the difficulties about measuring total factor productivity when you've got these resource-intensive sectors who, as I say, are using, as it were, the natural capital, the stuff underneath the earth, which we just don't measure very well. So the figures don't look quite so bad if you exclude those sectors, and that's one thing that makes me optimistic. But the main thing that makes me optimistic is artificial intelligence. I have the great privilege of working at Imperial College, which, as you might know, is a science and technology intensive university. If you go and look and see what the scientists and the technologists are doing, it is dominated by artificial intelligence. Everybody's got their favourite story, just one very quick story. There's a lot of interdisciplinary work that we do at Imperial, where, for example, the medics will get together with the engineers to help people who've, soldiers who've lost a limb in combat and so forth, right? There's a nice fusion of medicine and engineering. That interdisciplinary work is massively helped by artificial intelligence. So I'm very optimistic that will take off. What then do we need? What kind of institutions do we need to translate that possible increase in the kind of underlying fecundity of science into actual productivity that we see in the types of goods and services that we buy? And there are two things which we have to think about, and it again goes back to the theme which Helen opened with, which is these are choices for the Chancellor. This is not a God-given thing, these are just choices for the Chancellor. The first is the public sector. The public sector, there's a nice chapter on the public sector I notice in the Green Budget here. The public sector, up until the pandemic, was more or less neutral in terms of productivity. It had sort of mild productivity growth. It didn't really subtract, it maybe added a little bit. Since the pandemic, the public sector has been a big drag on productivity. So you've seen lots of numbers, so forgive me, I'm just going to give you two. Since the pandemic, productivity in the UK in terms of GDP per hour has been going up by a rather miserable 0.3%. The drag from the health service, that's dragged it down by minus 0.2%. So if we could just get the health service back to where it was, we could go from 0.3% to 0.5% productivity. That will be a lot more labour productivity. So that is one big challenge. That is a choice for the government to make about how it runs those public services and how AI might affect those things. The second choice that the government has to make is that the types of investment that firms need to make in order to translate that artificial intelligence into productivity are intangible style investments, better software, better business processes, better ways of running the firm. And we need an appropriate set of institutions to make that intangible investment attractive to firms. We've got a great set of universities, in my humble opinion. I would say that, wouldn't I? So that's helpful. We've got a terrible planning system, which does not help clusters of activity so that people can move next to those knowledge centres. We have reasonably liberal product markets, but we haven't helped ourselves, obviously, by Brexit. And as far as labour markets are concerned, for that type of economy, with that type of investment, we need more liberal labour markets. And anything then that freezes up the labour market is not a very good policy. So I'm optimistic, but again, go back to what Helen said before, I'm optimistic on the power of AI, but it is a choice that the government can make about spreading that power of AI, thereby getting some more productivity growth, and that will get us out of a lot of the difficulties that you've seen talked about today. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
So thanks very much. The privilege of going last after everyone's already said everything falls to me. So I had the privilege of being here last year as well. And I have to say, once again, my main reflection is that I'm very happy to be here commentating rather than inside the OBR trying to figure out what the numbers should be. But looking through the report, one reflection I had was that all the analysis there just reminds me that there seems to be a slightly lost art within government of stepping back and trying to find the right answer before layering on all of the political constraints that are very real, but that you would hope don't lock you out of the right answers. Being a former Treasury official of a certain vintage, I remember all the named reviews that used to be a feature of the Gordon Brown era, where if you wanted an answer, you spent a year with someone reviewing everything, and then you decided how much of it to implement. Now, why have we lost that? My sense is we lost probably 4 years focusing on how to implement Brexit. That was an enormous amount of resource that was sucked into one question. Then at least two years dealing with the pandemic, a year with the energy crisis. So there has not been a lot of time for thinking about these other questions. Then came the election of 2024, and that one I look back at with, well, last year I said I lamented where we had landed, because that was an election that kind of, for us fiscal folk, the defining feature was either ignoring or denying what was going to have to happen after the election. And it was all very predictable and predicted, and has happened since. And I wondered how we could get to a stage where, in the run-up to the election, the previous government could cut employee national insurance by a third at a cost of £20 billion a year, paid for with what my former boss memorably described as fictional public spending plans. Then after the election, when the fiction had to be removed from the forecast and public spending plans rise by tens of billions, it's impossible to reverse that tax cut. That seems to be a terrible place to have landed. But why all this history? It feels very relevant to where we are today in this question about what to do in filling this fiscal hole that everyone seems to be reasonably agreed is in that kind of low tens of billions of pounds. Now, I think it's probably good news that everyone's taking as read that the hole should be filled, not that the fiscal targets should be loosened. They're pretty much as loose as you can get. And obviously, Moin and his colleagues in the gilt market are looking very closely. So if we wanted to step back and think about what really we should do, or what the right answer is here, I think we need to ask some slightly different questions. So to put it two ways, are we consolidating because the economy is underperforming, our tax revenues are therefore underperforming, and we need to cut the size of the state to fit that new reality, which is basically the kind of post-financial crisis experience? Or are we transitioning to a larger state, in which case we need more revenue to pay for that state? And I thought the defence chapter in the Green Budget set out some of those things quite nicely, because I think it's largely the latter. We've got higher health spending for demographic reasons, and probably the cost of Jonathan's AI colleagues. We've got higher defence spending needs. We've got higher debt interest. Nothing can really be done about those. If we still want schools and courts and prisons and bin collections, then the tax take has to rise. And if that is the right answer, then you think surely the tax levers to pull have to be the big ones that everyone pays, and that do the least economic damage. Now, the real world, of course, is not as simple as that. So it's not an either or. We're not either in should spending be cut or should taxes be raised. And there's lots on that in the budget. I thought I would just reflect on a couple of big issues outside of this, where, again, kind of stepping back and finding the right answer seems so important. So first, on the health and disability benefits, which have been rising really, really quickly since the pandemic. So I looked back at some of the OBR back catalogue. So we did a report on disability benefits in 2019 that highlighted lots of worrying trends. Immediately after the pandemic struck, we revised up our forecast for this on the assumption that there would be some kind of scarring effect, some kind of lasting effect. And I remember talking privately to Helen's predecessor, whose name escapes me, who told me in no uncertain terms that assuming that this thing would rise forever was a bit crazy. And actually, it's risen even faster than we feared. But we're kind of 5 years on from then, and I think there's still no good answer to what's going on. There's lots of hypotheses. There's probably it's risen a lot, so there's going to be lots of reasons. But there's no really good list that says the underlying drivers are A, B, and C. And you can see that in the policy response. You need to know the root causes to address them. And instead, what we got earlier in the year was very much a spreadsheet answer that if we change the following, we will cut a certain amount of spending away, worked in a spreadsheet, didn't cope with exposure to the real world. And then the second one, which I hesitate to speak about in front of the real experts, is property tax, where our three main property taxes are all horrible in their own way. So stamp duty is really terrible for labour mobility, regional movement, for growth. Council tax, horribly unfair, regressive within places and unfair across places. And then business rates, which is, as someone who now dwells in the private sector advising, the most hated of all of the business taxes, where it seems to have been reviewed every 2 years, but never properly reformed. And indeed, the latest reforms look like they add more cliff edges and more anti-growth, anti-investment features. So if anywhere needs a blank sheet of paper and the right answer, and most importantly, a transition plan to get from here to there without the losers causing political constraints that stop it, I think it's that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to invite some other our speakers back to join the panel so you can all see them. And introduce Ben as he walks up. So Ben Zaranko is Associate Director at the IFS, who works on public finances, but also has been an editor of this year's Green Budget, so on top of all the details. I've also got lots of my colleagues and other colleagues from Barclays sitting in the front row with a roving microphone, so there are lots of people ready to take your questions. But while you're thinking of your questions, before we kick off, I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask a couple of things. And I'll ask you, Jonathan. So Jack emphasised his concern about inflation, and in particular this idea that ordinarily the Bank of England might look through any kind of fiscally driven inflation as a sort of a temporary thing. But currently we have high inflation, maybe the inflation stickier as you discussed. I mean, how worried do you think Rachel Reeves should be about this? I mean, to what extent do you think she should just be avoiding all things that are inflationary because of this issue about the Bank of England maybe not looking through it?
I think it's thanks, Helen. Sorry, is the microphone on?
Yeah,
thank you. I think it is another worry. It's another choice. And again, it's somewhat like the headroom situation. We've had fairly persistent inflation in the UK for really quite a long time now. Were inflation to have been much closer to target, then I think the bank would have been much more willing to tolerate a little blip up of inflation because of temporary increases in VAT or whatever it is that the Chancellor chooses to do. But in the context of having had inflation above target for quite a while, I think it makes it much more risky for her to go for inflationary style increases because the bank might be forced to think that might be embodied in expectations and in wage demands, get some inflationary momentum going, and the bank might be forced to think that. That would be, some people on the bank would think that. Other people on the bank, of course, view deflation and the poor state of the economy and so forth as pulling those things down. So there would be discussion around the table. But I think the momentum would shift much more towards those people who would say, let's postpone rate increases.
Great, thank you. Can I ask you a question, Andy, about this is obviously difficult for Richard Hughes and his team to making this choice about productivity. I mean, Jonathan gave us an optimistic scenario here about AI, although noting that there are choices the government could make that would affect how strongly that came through. I mean, I might ask you to reflect on, how does the OBR, how could and should the OBR at this point in time think about trying to balance they have been over-optimistic. You could, people have argued that they should have downgraded before now, they've waited this long, at some point you have to downgrade, but there is an optimistic scenario now, and if you downgrade too quickly, you can do too much. So how do you navigate, having had to navigate these things, how do you go about navigating what is inherently uncertain?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm not sure I have a great track record having done 10 years of OBR productivity forecasting, which the famous hedgehog chart from Ben's recent article. But I mean, this is just like any other forecast, isn't it, that has to be reviewed against the evidence again and again. But in some elements of this, the evidence is sketchy. So that vital component, total factor productivity, is a residual in a calculation. So it's the bit that by definition is unexplained, and therefore the forecast is much more strongly than other areas is a judgment. And the judgment, so I worked with 3 different economy leads on the committee, and the first, Professor Nicol, was in the early post-financial crisis years, very kept reminding the staff that the thing that economists do too much is put too much weight on the very recent past, and they change their view too quickly. And so he, stuck with productivity growth will return to 2.2 in the end. He finally threw his hands up in the air in his final year there and took 0.2 off. Then Charlie Bean arrived, and he thought that we'd made a mistake in the previous years and we should have revised down more materially, and so he did. And that's the big downward revision that you refer to in the chapter. And then David joined around the pandemic time and has been looking at this from, he is, I think, a naturally techno-optimist kind of way of looking at things, but the outturn data has been very disappointing relative to the forecast. So it's that balancing act of like my sense is that his kind of instinct and judgment says productivity growth will pick up for reasons like technological optimism, for reasons like the shocks must have been part of the reason why it's been weak. And that balancing act between it should pick up and how far it will pick up is what they will have done over the summer. I don't think anyone who confidently says this is right and that is wrong should be trusted. This is a highly uncertain judgment. I'm sure they will have some scenarios around it to help people understand what will happen if the world looks different.
Great, thank you. Before I'm going to ask the top question that's been asked online, because it very much relates to this. I might ask you first, Jack. The question is basically, how fast would the economy need to grow for Rachel Reeves to meet her fiscal rules without any cuts or tax rises? I think this partly speaks to this uncertainty point, that even if you are a real optimist, there's a difference between being optimistic about the kind of medium to long run and thinking that it will ride to the rescue quickly enough that you don't have to do anything now. So, Jack, do we know a sense of scale? What would have to happen in the next 3 or 4 years for growth just to be the answer? Do you have a good sense of that?
We'd need to see essentially the type of growth rates the OBR had in their March EFO come through, and to see the market kind of notice that and bring down yields a little bit. So I think what we've seen is a combination of lower growth in the forecast, but also yields in financial markets tightening and taking out a few more billion. But broadly, if we could get to the kind of 1.8, 1.9% medium-term growth, which is close to half a percentage point more than we have, then you get into a world where things are much more sustainable. And obviously that's what we saw back in March. But as you've stressed enough times now, it's a case that actually those small revisions and that uncertainty about 5 years ahead is significantly large enough that you can have differences of view that shouldn't be determining fiscal policy.
Great. Okay, let's take some questions in the room. Oh, lots of hands already. I'll take a little group of them, and then we'll do another round. So let's start at the front, because it's the first person I saw, and then I'll work backwards.
Paul Swinney from the Data City. My summary of the event is that we're on a 6-month hamster wheel of fiscal events where we're hand-wringing about fiscal headroom, and it seems like we are praying for an AI miracle to get us out of this. Is that fair assessment? If it is going to be requiring an AI miracle, is that going to be delivered by the private sector, or what should the public sector do? And if it's not AI that's going to give us growth, then what are the other policy interventions we should be doing to try and encourage that?
Great, thank you. All right, everyone's got their own analogy. I use fiscal. I did ground all day. You've got the hamster wheel. Okay, let's take a few other questions. Who else had a question? Okay, let's do this gentleman here, then we'll go backwards. Thank you.
I just wonder to what extent artificial intelligence has been fully taken into account in your analyses. Jonathan, you mentioned briefly about the work that's been done in Imperial and then factored that into your more optimistic view. But people are quoting statistics that graduate employment in the United States has basically dropped off a cliff as a result of AI. And we know The Economist, for example, has been looking at those companies that have improved their AI capability, and their employment is going down. So does your optimism about productivity reflect the fact that actually we may have higher unemployment rates as a consequence of that?
Lovely, thank you very much. And there's a question just over here, Greg, in the sort of middle. Thank you.
Thank you, David Robinson, Market News. A variant of that question is, should the OBR be allowed to forecast productivity as an outlier? In the day after Philippe Aghion wins the Nobel Prize, there's a very compelling argument for productivity optimism. But you're in an economic civil war. You could have one economist appointed to the OBR produces an optimistic outlook. You could have one produces a much less one. Should it really try and line up somewhere with consensus or markets so you get less volatility forecast by forecast?
Wonderful, thank you. Lovely, juicy questions. Jonathan, shall I come to you first about about AI and to what extent maybe what should we expect from AI? What is it the public sector, the private sector? What do private sector need to do? And are we factoring in higher unemployment? Let's start with that group of things.
Yeah, thanks. Really good questions. I'll take slight issue with the gentleman at the front here, if I may. We're not praying for AI at Imperial. We're working on AI at Imperial. And other good universities are available, I should say. So I shouldn't say that. So look, this is going to require hard work, but there's an important point there, which is, of course, firms are going to have to spend big amounts of money in order to implement all of this. Now, to your question, the other gentleman was asking, you're right, that may well displace some labour. I am, as an economist, confident that the tasks which AI can do, there are going to be other tasks which we haven't even thought of yet, like working with AI, which those workers can do. And I think the history of employment in the teeth of these technological revolutions is that the labour market is flexible enough to reflect all of that. But where that gets you to is what I was trying to say at the end, which is what are the conditions under which AI is going to translate into productivity in the economy. And that, David, you referred to the Nobel Prize winners. What the Nobel Prize winners, what their Nobel Prize was about what the institutional conditions are in order to have a technological change. In John McKeo's case, the British Industrial Revolution, how those institutional changes were there in order to bring forward that technical change. And we need that decent set of institutions to do all of that. And that's all the things that you'll find in the Green Budget here around stability, around flexible labour markets, universities, things like that.
Yeah. Perhaps I'll just add briefly, I think another challenge for the government, for all governments, not just this one, will be thinking about the set of institutions that also make sure that AI works for us in the way we want to work for us, and that it works with the labour market in the way we want it to work. I think it's a big unknown, right? We're going to see how AI rolls out and where it's complementary to labour and where it's substituted with labour. I think we have an important and difficult role for policymakers to try to get the institutions to establish how we navigate that. Jack, do you want to add anything on how you think about AI sort of feeding into your analysis?
Yeah, so I mean, we had this pickup in our analysis of total factor productivity. We give a range of reasons actually of what could drive that. So it's not just praying or working on an AI miracle. You know, there are things around more openness as an economy and trying to realign our trading relationships with big partners like the EU, and there is kind of investment in human capital within the UK's own workforce. These are all things that could also have positive productivity effects. So I don't think it's just waiting on an AI, but we do assume that there is some pickup in productivity. Now, in terms of how it feeds in, we don't assume that it de facto and by default will raise unemployment. I think the kind of academic and empirical evidence on that is relatively mixed, that you tend to get some combination of just having the same number of workers but they're more productive, and in some sectors you have to get a transition period. But actually it's not clear on my read of where the kind of the evidence is that you necessarily end up with structurally higher unemployment going forward. So we didn't build any of that in. But I mean, I think that just touching on the kind of the point on the OBR and kind of consensus rounded out. I mean, we're always kind of criticised as a profession, as economists, of groupthink. So I think actually having to force someone to groupthink by definition is less than ideal. And so having alternative views, as we've all said, this is a very uncertain judgment. I think that's actually beneficial. The difficulty is not that the OBR has a different view on productivity to kind of everyone else on the market or a lot of other people in the market. It's that difference of opinion, which can be plus or minus a very small amount, a very large distance into the future, can have such big near-term fiscal consequences. And so I don't think it's that they're out of consensus. I think it's actually the structure. But the fiscal rules are imperfect. All fiscal rules are imperfect. And where we are at the moment, as the markets chapter that my colleagues put together shows, is that we really need credibility to those fiscal rules.
Great, thanks, Jack. Andy, do you want to come in on this point about is it unusual that the OBR is should the OBR be forced to be more in consensus?
I mean, my view is that if the OBR is going to be away from consensus on the economy, it just needs a very good reason. I think one of the reasons there's been this expectation that they will revise down is that they've had a stronger productivity forecast, but not a particularly strong story for why. It's somewhat different on the fiscal side because the OBR has much more information than anyone else about what's going on with the public finances. But on the economy, it's looking at the same evidence as everyone. And if it does have a particularly strong story for wanting to be away from consensus, then that's perfectly fine. That's the statutory job of the committee members. I think where it's got to a little bit has been, you know, we're more optimistic because we're more optimistic, and that's probably not a good place to be.
It's also worth maybe reminding people, for those people who aren't, you know, like us, completely seeped in all of these big numbers. I mean, think about the headroom. The 10 billion sounds like an awful lot of money, and of course it is compared to all of our personal finances, at least my personal finances. But it's the equivalent of saying to somebody who has a house, estimate the value of your house in 3 years' time, and you think your house is worth roughly £300,000. This is like saying, I want you to estimate the value of that house within £1,000 in 5 years' time. That is really, really hard. So, you know, of course the difference is in forecasts, but actually we shouldn't overestimate how different these forecasts are. This is a really, really difficult, uncertain thing to do. And actually, you know, any politician should expect to have kind of contingencies for when forecasts move around. Ben, you were nodding along. Before I ask any more questions, do you want to say anything about AI or fiscal forecasts?
Yeah, can I add one just thought on AI in the public sector, which is the big pressure going forward is the healthcare system, right, and dealing with demographics. But the story of the past is not that technological advances come along and make the health system cheaper to run. The story is that technological advances come along and invent all sorts of new treatments and things we can do and problems we can solve that we couldn't previously. And we decide we want those, please, and we'd like the NHS to pay for them. And I just think, even if AI is revolutionary, I don't know that I'd be assuming it's going to save the government huge sums. It could well be allowing us to do things more productively, but we'll just do more of them as a result. And so banking on it as a big cost saver, I'm slightly nervous about.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to take one of the popular factual questions online, and I'll come back to the room. Maybe I'll ask you this first, Jack, but Jonathan might want to come in. So the question is, what effect does inequality, income and wealth, have on savings rate and consumption? Is it the case that we have some people with no savings spending little and others with lots of money but don't know what to spend it on. So it's, to your point about how important the savings rate is here, what's going on with the savings rate?
Yeah, I mean, so we did see an increase in balances across the distribution as we kind of moved into COVID, and we have seen them run down much more quickly in people in the lower ends of the income distribution. That's true. But I think on our modelling, the biggest thing that has really driven the increase in savings has been some combination of uncertainty as people are worried about a rising unemployment rate and a slowing economy. The fact that interest rates have stayed higher than most people expected. So actually it's the right decision in terms of if you're working out whether to save or spend, that's a kind of a, you know, pays you more to save. And then the last thing is just that people's wealth to income, so the kind of the assets they hold was here. It dropped a lot, and now they're trying to recover some of that. So those are the bigger drivers of savings rather than necessarily the distributional story. But that story of, you know, there are a significant number of people who don't have the savings that they need to be able to go out and spend, and they are constrained in their ability to spend. That is a story that has been part of the discussion for a while.
Yeah. Do you know anything, Jonathan? No. Great. Okay, wonderful. Let's take some more questions from the room. So let's go to the back, to Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed Jami, Director of Economic Policy at the CBI. There was in the discussion, we talked a lot about numbers, but less about sort of sentiment, and in particular, I mean, the first time sort of talked about the savings ratios in the household sense, but on the business side, what we hear from a lot of businesses is that they would be willing to invest and that they would get off the fence and making investment decisions. But to that point that sort of Helen, you made, and Paul mentioned about the hamster wheel, is that continuous cycle of uncertainty and not having sufficient headroom is also creating that uncertainty in the business world, in particular when it comes to business investment. And I just wondered to what extent, in particular Treasury, but also the OBR is aware of just the damage that causes, because some of that doesn't come through in the data where decisions aren't made or investment goes elsewhere, and whether some of that should be given a bit more weight. And I guess related to that is if we agree with that, then how do you get sort of the Treasury and other organisations to appreciate that, you know, there are people at the end of the day making some of these judgment calls, and if they are unsure, these investments will go elsewhere and will continue to be in the cycle of, you know, investment decision being put off 6 months, and before you know it, you've lost, you know, years or even decades of investment potential in the UK.
Great, thank you very much. I'll take a few questions at the same time. I'll come down to the person in the green jumper, then we'll go to the back. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the talk and the Green Budget. Very interesting read. Ben Blaker from the Home Office. I was wondering, how can we be fully optimistic about reaping the benefits of AI if we have startups like Clio saying it's impossible to list on the London Stock Exchange? Do you not think, you know, I feel like a lot of AI innovation is going to come from disruptive startups. Do you not think we need to push things like the Mansion House Accord, push this financing reform further in order to be able to say that we can fully reap these benefits, be optimistic about all these productivity changes, or else, you know, all of these firms are going to leave to the US?
Wonderful, thank you very much. And there's a question right at the back. Thank you.
Hello, Derek McAllister, independent consultant. In the view of the fact that it is felt that the way things are currently structured leads to what is perceived as being overly aggressive tax planning in advance of fiscal events, is it ever conceivable that a Chancellor, and in particular Reach Reform Accounts, might introduce legislation with retrospective effect?
Great, thank you very much. Should we start with a question, and I'll come to you first, Jonathan, first, that Mohammed asked about sentiment. I mean, just to say quickly first, I mean, one of the reasons we're highlighting that this policy volatility is damaging is because of the direct damage that it does to investment incentives, and it's good academic evidence now that uncertainty holds back investment. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about that, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, unfortunately, forecasting institutions are completely on top of this. And the reason I say unfortunately is this became a massive issue in Brexit, where investment almost immediately after the referendum, investment in the UK completely flatlined. Why was that? Well, it was exactly the reason that you were just saying, that Helen has just said, which is that firms who are very uncertain, there's an option value of waiting. In other words, you want to postpone your investment decision until the uncertainty is resolved. And that's why this hamster wheel thing is so damaging. Where that takes you then, and I'll make a slightly more sort of sociological point, if I may, is I had the privilege of working at the Bank of England along with Jack, and we spent a lot of time actually going around talking to businesses. People at the bank, tour around and talk to businesses and all. There's a whole network of agents. So I do think that uncertainty issue that you've raised is actually quite inculcated in the thinking, at least of the bank. I mean, I leave Andy to comment about other institutions. So that's something where, unfortunately, the lessons we learned from Brexit actually have been learned.
Andy, do you want to comment on that and how the OBR thinks about kind of that uncertainty around policy and how that affects the forecast? Or how they should think about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things they think about, yes, definitely. And yes, living through the post-referendum Brexit years, wondering if how much clarity was required before investment could start to recover was a big thing. The OBR obviously made its name by being the institution that put a number on the cost of Brexit of 4%. On productivity. By the time we got to Brexit being implemented, as I remember the numbers, a third of that effect had already come through due to foregone investment due to the uncertainty. So that was not how we expected it in 2016. It was how it looked by then, and so obviously that was familiar. Now, whether the kind of rather less dramatic churn of not enough headroom, slightly optimistic forecast, let's wait for the next fiscal hole and how it's going to be filled, whether that is given the same weight as that kind of single event, what's Brexit doing? I'm 2 years out of date on how the process works, but it's something that everyone's very familiar with. I thought just on that hamster wheel point, I mean, I think it's interesting that you're seeing a certain amount of briefing out there that maybe fiscal headroom should be higher. I think hopefully that's being floated, and now the response of everyone that would be great will register. But it's not just having more headroom. I think that having a slightly optimistic forecast in most people's view is the other part of the problem, because the majority view expects a downward revision. If they expect a downward revision and you've only got teeny tiny headroom, they also expect a policy response. And if all the sensible taxes are ruled out and most of public spending is considered to be kind of politically off limits, then you get into that damaging thing. And Mo probably speaks to more business than I do, but I get exactly the same message of, how long should we wait before we're going to know enough? And that has real world consequences.
And actually, I just underline that point about it's the combination of factors, including all of these commitments on the tax side. I mean, had Rachel Reeves not had these big tax commitments, these big tax locks, and she hadn't ruled out the sort of lots of things, I think you'd get less speculation about all the itty bitty things, because you might more naturally expect the Chancellor needs to do something. She has lots of options. She'll go for an easy option. The fact that so many of them seem constrained is why we're getting speculation about all these itty-bitty taxes and what they could do. And they're often the ones that either aren't very well designed and therefore increasing them would be damaging, or you'd need to go a long way to get any real money. I think that is part of the mix there. Does anyone want to add anything on sentiment before I ask the next question on Home Office? No. Jonathan, can I come to you about this issue about listing on the London Stock Exchange? It's one thing that people talk about increasingly. Do we know why people don't want to list on the London Stock Exchange?
It's a whole combination of factors, and there's an active debate about whether the London Stock Exchange is too restrictive and all of that. But if I can just step back for a second, there are two big ways that we're going to get AI to raise productivity. One is if we produce lots of AI, and then just by an averaging, that will improve productivity. And we do indeed produce loads of AI, DeepMind and all those various sectors. We've got a very active information services sector. The second, though, is the key to it, and that's if we use lots of AI, getting firms, the health service and things like that, as Ben was just mentioning earlier on, to use AI. So I'm actually not that worried about whether firms do or don't list on the stock market, frankly. What I want to see, because these are where the big numbers are, is to get firms, public sector, private sector, to actually be using AI, and that requires a different set of institutions and incentives.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps I'll take the final question on the tax planning and whether it's conceivable we'll see something retrospective. I mean, it's of course right that it's speculation about future taxes that might change, that causes people to change their behaviour in advance of a budget. Of course, even if there's no speculation in advance, once taxes are changed, most of them will go on to change behaviour. And that's why when we're saying you should choose your tax rises carefully, you want to choose the tax rises that are going to do least to dampen incentives. But on the narrow question of could she do something retrospective, I mean, yes, in the sense that it's perfectly possible to write a piece of legislation that says we'll levy a tax based on something that happened in the past. Chancellors don't do it very often, but it would be something that they could do. Let me take one question that's popular online, and then I'll come back to the room. I'm going to let my panel decide if anyone wants to answer it. Is there any risk or chance that the Chancellor resorts to more unorthodox measures like reforming or stopping paying interest on Bank of England deposits in order to raise money? I mean, Ben, do you want to start with explaining what that means to people, and I'll let the others decide whether they want to comment on it?
Yeah, sure. The very first thing to say is if they were going to do it, it's exactly the sort of thing you wouldn't brief about and you would try and keep quiet. So I think it's hard to know what's under discussion. The key point here is that one of the reasons why our debt interest bill has shot up so fast and by so much is that a big chunk of our debt is held by the Bank of England, and that is remunerated at the Bank of England's policy rate to the financial institutions which hold reserves there. So when Bank of England increases its interest rate, as it's done over the last few years, the Treasury compensates the bank and you end up with a big bill. And some people are saying that, well, do we need to be paying quite so much out to those commercial banks? Is that necessary to operate monetary policy well? Could we not just either lower that interest rate, or could we even just have the bank make losses and keep it on its balance sheet and not send a bill to the Treasury at the end of the day? That's a bit of a rough description, but you get the gist. The point is, are you going to fiddle around with monetary policy plumbing to try and save the Treasury on its debt interest bill? Which I think is something you'd want to think extraordinarily carefully about before going into. I don't feel qualified to give a confident answer either way. If you really want to get into this, we actually had a chapter on this in the Green Budget 3 years ago by Paul Tucker, who used to be Deputy Governor at the bank. If you want to read 70 pages of proper detailed analysis of this, if you've got any holidays coming up. I'll stop there. Let's see if any others have thoughts. I know Jack, you thought about this a lot in a previous life.
Yeah, in a previous life, and as one might imagine at Barclays, Barclays colleagues and I have written quite extensively on some of this. I mean, this ultimately becomes a bank tax by a different means. It's using a kind of an arm of monetary policy, arm of kind of central banks to carry out fiscal policy, essentially. And if what you think is that, profitability of banks is not where you want it to be, or you want to raise money from that sector, a direct bank tax is fiscal policy done by fiscal policy makers. Whereas, we've heard the Governor of the Bank of England, we've heard the Chancellor herself at different times kind of mention that this is getting into the realms of monetary policy, and in a way that might complicate the job of monetary policy makers. So we did some analysis a year or two ago now, looking at exactly if you did this, how much money could you raise, and where would the incidence ultimately fall? And in order to do something that raised, on our estimates, sufficient money to make it kind of fiscally worthwhile, you would end up seeing a tightening of financial conditions. So deposit rates would fall, borrowing rates would rise in order to offset that. And that would ultimately, the evidence and kind of the academic literature suggests to us, that would ultimately fall on people who were, kind of more credit constrained, that were requiring borrowing in order to kind of fund their investment and their spending. And that has economic consequences. So all of that needs to be factored in, I think, when you take these. But a Chancellor with choices to make and limited options, certainly this is something people are looking at.
Jonathan, do you want to come in on this?
I'll just be quick. I defer to Jack and Ben about this. As Ben was just saying, the government pays interest on government bonds, a piece of paper, written IOU. The government also pays interest on deposits in interest rate reserves. So if we're going to stop paying interest on bank reserves, why don't we just stop paying interest on government bonds? That would be an equivalent thing to do, and that would probably save a lot of money. But that would be a sensationally bad idea.
One slightly just, add some disagreement on the panel, I suppose.
Go on.
Other central banks do this differently, I suppose. So the European Central Bank already operates a tiered reserve system. The Federal Reserve treats its losses very differently to how the Bank of England does. So the UK is an interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, but the UK recognises these losses very transparently in a very upfront way compared to some other countries. And I don't know that we get any benefit from doing that. It doesn't seem clear to me, at least from the outside, looking at markets and so on, that we've been rewarded for our honesty and our transparency in terms of our borrowing costs. So there's at least there are international precedents we could think about as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring in Moyen Islam from Barclays.
Yeah, hi.
You're on.
Hi, yeah, so I'm a rate strategist, so I guess I live in the weeds of central bank plumbing, which I assure you is not a great neighbourhood. I guess my observation would be it's exactly what Jonathan and Ben said, it'd be a very brave Ministry of Finance to tinker with monetary policy plumbing, because and you're not doing it for the right reasons, you're doing it to save money. That's not a great look for anyone, I would say. Secondly, it's what Ben described, how other central banks do it, and I'm going to bore you all for 30 seconds, I promise. It's likely to do with the structure of reserves, which is that the ECB, for example, has a minimum reserve requirement. The UK just has a non-zero reserve requirement. So you can say, well, we pay nothing on the minimum requirement and we pay you something on the other stuff. There are ways of doing it. So it would require changes in how you run things as well. And, I always say, to do things like this, does it make monetary policy more efficient? Does it make the transmission mechanism better? I would argue it's putting sand in an engine, and it might splutter a bit, it might kind of work, but it doesn't work any better. And an observation I made to someone a long time ago was plumbing is the kind of thing you never need to know about. Try calling a plumber on Christmas Eve, etc., when your toilet blows up or something like that. Good luck. And I think monetary policy plumbing should be the kind of thing that should be the preserve of people like me and Jack, and right-thinking people should never know about it, because when you do find out about it, it maybe doesn't look great. And I speak as someone who sat in a city dealing room in 2007, 2009, and I assure you, you don't want to find out about monetary policy plumbing, which is where a lot of people did find out about monetary policy plumbing. And I don't think it's a particularly great experience or one you want to relive. But Jack and I have written a lot about this, so if you want to have a chat about it, grab yourself strong coffee and we can talk about it.
Great, thank you. I think the takeaway there is definitely not a simple just money getting button you can press. Let's have another round of questions. We'll do one down the front here and then we'll go to the middle. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Tomohiro Ebuchi from Nikkei, a Japanese media outlet. My question is also about the borrowing costs. So now the UK's government bond yields are the highest among the G7 nations, and Japan is the lowest. And looking at Japan, despite having the much larger debt to GDP ratio than the UK, the yields are 1/3 of the UK. And it's partially because bonds are held by Japanese people. So I'm not saying Japanese situation is good, but my question is there any possibility to lower the UK yields by measures affecting the bond market, such as changing the composition of the bond holders? Thank you.
Wonderful, lovely question. Thank you. We'll go to James in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, James Howard, Labour Together. I think the logical conclusion of a lot of what you said is, it's got to be a pretty big budget and you want to do things that reassure bond markets. And so you're probably looking at broad-based tax rises that hit, average household budgets. If you're working backwards from 2028, 2028, 2029, and you think about the impact on interest rates and yields of doing those things and the right thing economically, does the benefit of that kind of a household budget through mortgage costs, lower bills because investment costs have fallen, are households better off? Like, is the average household better off if you're doing tighter fiscal policy but getting looser monetary policy by 2029, or would you expect the average household to be worse off within that kind of medium term if you do a broad-based tax rise?
Love it. Thank you very much. Have anyone had questions at the moment? No, Grace. Well, I'll also say I'll feed in some from online. So let's take the question about, based on the comparison with Japan and why we have higher yields, and could we get the yields down by changing the composition of lenders? Anyone want to pick that up?
I'm happy to have a first pass. So, I mean, I would say there's obviously structural differences between the Japanese market and the UK market. I think the composition of investors within the market naturally kind of ebbs and flows. I'm not sure it's something you necessarily want to mandate. Governments tend to do it through incentives, and actually, you know, the composition of the debt itself reflects the composition of investors rather than, you know, having to try and drive that. But I would say in the UK that a couple of things that are not related to that composition, but, you know, in Moeen's chapter he talks about how the UK needs to react to this kind of change in the kind of investor base and demand. A couple of things that help that aren't anything to do with that investor base necessarily. You know, part of the reason the UK has higher yields is because the front end, the short-term interest rates, those set by the Bank of England, and the expectations of the path they will follow is higher. You know, people are expecting interest rates in the UK from policy to stay higher for longer than in a lot of comparable countries, and the level is just higher. That feeds through as the kind of the starting point for the rest of the kind of the interest rates in the bond market. So policies, as we said in the chapter, that are inflationary, that keep that higher for longer, they keep that difference in the kind of the difference of government bond rates. So things that aren't inflationary, that allow the Bank of England to cut more, that would naturally just bring down and reduce that differential. The other thing, and we've all spoken about this, is fiscal credibility. And, you know, as part of this kind of hamster wheel, pick your metaphor, but having fiscal credibility on top of whatever is happening with the Bank of England and short-term interest rates, that credibility reduces the additional premium, the additional amount that you expect from the government in terms of interest payments in order to entice people to hold that debt. And so a plan that comes out that says, here's fiscal credibility, be it more headroom, be it you know, tighten in a way that minimises the impact on growth, whatever that is, that will also bring down the longer end of the government bond curve, and that would be beneficial. So I think actually, yes, the compositional base is different for investors. Yes, we've seen that shift in the UK, but actually there are other more fundamental factors that I think can shift that difference.
Thank you, Jack. Do you want to come in on that, Andy?
I was just thinking the fundamental difference between the UK and Japan is the current account balance. So the UK doesn't get to choose who buys its bonds because it's borrowing from overseas to balance the economy more generally. But the other thing that is quite striking is essentially that's a question about should the government pursue financial repression in some form, force people to hold gilts so that the interest rates are lower because, and the problem is, the interpretation of that is that the because is because they won't do what's necessary to put the budget on a sustainable path. The question about not paying interest on reserves at the Bank of England is pretty similar, also heads towards fiscal dominance of the central bank. These are kind of things that are talked about. They're kind of slippery slopes and they're kind of dangerous undermining of institutions, and so I think those are things that, you know, you always want to be very careful of. Can we just force the interest rate to be lower?
Great, thank you. Before I get to James's specific question, I'll take a few questions on tax, because there's lots and lots of love for tax, or at least love for tax questions online. So the most popular question right now, but actually there's a few in the spirit, is should the government bite the bullet and increase some combination of VAT, income tax, national insurance? Let me just comment on that briefly, and I'll ask others about James's question. And what we had a big chapter on tax out on Monday, so there's 65 pages you can trawl through if you wish. It's worth saying that if the Chancellor wants to raise 10, 15, 20 billion, she could do that without raising the top three taxes. This is not a case where she just can't do it. You can raise more money from council tax, inheritance taxes, capital taxes, sin taxes if you want to. So this is not a question of she can't physically do it or technically do it. It's a question of should she do it. I think it's also worth saying there's a big difference in my mind between trying to raise 10 billion and 40 billion. I mean, they are very different numbers in tax terms. I think raising 10 without touching the top three would be relatively straightforward. Raising 40 without touching the top three is going to be very, very difficult. So I think, in part, what she might want to turn to will depend on the kind of scale of the tax rise she is trying to find. But it is just true mechanically, because the big tax bases are income and consumption, it is much more straightforward to get revenues from those taxes. It's also the case that if you are trying to get large revenues from the smaller taxes, I mean, Andy had a nice example of property tax. I wholeheartedly agree that part of the tax system is in dire need of sorting out. The danger is that if you are going to go to those taxes that are particularly damaging already, and you're going to have to raise them quite a lot to get significant revenue, you're then doing really quite a lot of economic damage. But again, there are huge opportunities there to reform those bits of the tax system. And if she did a proper reform of property taxes, capital gains taxes, capital income taxes more broadly, then I think there would be opportunities to reduce the drag on growth. Then you could raise revenues without doing as much damage. So I think this is where it really does matter what you are thinking of on a tax front. So that addresses a bunch of the tax questions. But on James's particular question about how the effect of sort of tighter fiscal policy and looser monetary policy in coming years. I'm going to come to you first, Jack. I mean, it's a basic question of how much bang would you get through credibility or through lower interest rates from doing a fiscal tightening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less in the kind of the general answer. It's less about a fiscal tightening being beneficial. I think there's a different conversation here about austerity, which is a conversation that was had before, versus kind of easy monetary policy. But I think it is about credible fiscal policy delivers benefits, and fiscal policy that is not seen as credible delivers costs. And actually, if you look at a credible fiscal policy that allows the Bank of England to continue to ease, that takes out some of that premium in terms of borrowing costs for the government that we've seen, then that does ease the burden directly. I mean, you can look at surveys, the CBI surveys at the moment show a reasonable number of firms are currently being put off making investment decisions by the cost of financing. And that cost of financing would come down if you were to see the Bank of England continuing to ease, and if reference rates at longer term, so kind of government bond rates often, would come down. Households, not only does lowering the government bond curve and kind of interest rates reduce the amount they have to pay in tax ultimately, because they're not having to fund a debt interest bill. So in the long run kind of lowers some of their tax burden. It also lowers the cost of things like their mortgages, and that does have a material impact. We have seen, and in the chapter we have some analysis using very granular level data on mortgage repayments at the moment, and you can see that there is a wave of people, even as interest rates have come down at the moment, who are coming off a 5-year mortgage and facing an increase of 2 percentage points on that mortgage increase. There's an escalation in the wave of those people coming off now, even at a time when the Bank of England has been easing. And that's the type of thing where it just really hits home. If you see a 2 percentage point increase in your mortgage kind of interest rate, that will affect your decisions as a kind of a consumer in a household. And so the more you can kind of build credibility and lower those rates, I think it's almost unambiguous that enables the economy to pick up. And actually, the passover we talk about in the chapter between public spending and the external global sector, that allows it to hand over to households in the UK, to businesses in the UK, to drive growth going forwards.
I was going to say something similar. I mean, I think we really should think about trying to do fiscal consolidation in a way that's least damaging directly to growth, has all these positive benefits. But I think we should also be realistic. If you're going to raise taxes by some large amount, that is going to have an effect on households, or you're going to cut spending, it's going to have an effect on households. So we all want the long run good stuff to come, but I don't think we should think there's a solution out there that basically means you do something that's so good that actually no one feels the effect of it. I think that we are going to feel the effect of it. I'm going to ask one more question from the online before I come back to the room. I might come to you first, Ben. We just talked about tax rises. Obviously, the Chancellor could cut spending. So there's a question here that's basically what could she cut?
Right. The three questions I think that any party that's saying they're going to cut huge sums from public spending need to be asked is, one, some combination of these. One, what is it we currently do that the government's going to stop doing? So until recently, we didn't provide childcare subsidies to parents with young children, for example. We managed for decades without doing that. We could decide we don't want to do that anymore. Or what is it we currently provide universally that we're going to start means testing. So we had some look at that with winter fuel, for example, which was received rather unkindly by the populace. Or what is it that we currently provide for free that we're going to start charging for? Or what do we currently charge a small amount for that we're going to increase charges for? So we have lots of NHS services are free, for example, or post-16 education is free. You could imagine a world where that wasn't the case. And I think that in the face of demographic pressures and cost and AI technology pressures on the health service and so on, I think it does take a serious amount of thought and effort to think about where we're going to save significant sums. I don't think just saying, oh, I'm going to delete 25% of the civil service and that's where the savings will come from. It is a serious attempt to grapple with the difficulty here. Now, I don't think public spending cuts are impossible. The spending settlements for departments for 3 years were agreed just in June. The Chancellor could turn around and say, sorry, I didn't know the OBR were going to downgrade productivity at that point, and no, I promised you all this money, but we're going to have to come back and shave some of that off. We're going to have to be less generous. They could do that, but that undermines the ability of departments to plan. It probably puts at risk some of these ambitions around public service improvements. And welfare. The overall working age welfare bill is pretty flat as a share of GDP, but some bits of it are going up very quickly. Could we try and make savings there? Of course. Could we try and pursue meaningful reforms around things like the spiraling cost of spending on children with additional needs? Undoubtedly, some of those services could be provided more efficiently. But these are all really difficult and things that I don't think are going to make much progress on. That's what Andy was saying earlier. If you start from, well, I need this many billions of savings, and you work backwards. And so I don't think spending cuts are by any means impossible, but it would require actually reckoning with the consequences of that and not just pretending we can magic up some efficiency solutions and pretend it's all going to be fine.
I used to add briefly as well, there's a great chapter in the Green Budget on productivity, and it already assumes some pretty punchy increases in productivity. So the government needs to deliver on those just to meet within its current plans before it starts doing anything different. Does anybody else want to comment on spending?
Yeah, I'll comment real quickly. One of the things, and I'm not involved with the IFS, so I can say nice things about the IFS since I'm independent from it. One of the things the IFS have done very helpfully, it seems to me, is to look at the big picture spending changes over a longer period of time, which I think was slightly behind, Ben, what you were saying. And what we've seen, if I understand the IFS stuff correctly, is over sort of the past 40, 50 years, we've greatly reduced defence expenditure and we've just massively increased health expenditure. Well, we just can't do that anymore. So I think that's point number one. And point number two, which again, I applaud the IFS for doing all this. If we're going to have a grown-up debate about all of this, we need to know what the numbers are. The big numbers, it seems to me, are on health spending. So we have to find a way, it seems to me, of doing something about health spending, either making it more efficient or finding some way of economising on that. Otherwise, we're going to be back to the hamster wheel or the whatever the thing is of trying to find little, what you called, Helen, I think, itty-bitty little changes here and there.
Andy?
One of my reflections from my years of the OBR is that public spending is analysed and projected almost exclusively in terms of how much it costs and not what it delivers. And so, at the risk of naming the wrong IF, the other institute down the road does a very nice tracker of a performance tracker of public services. That should be forecast. That should be forecast because the answer to Ben's question is, if you want that performance to improve, either how much does it cost or how can Jonathan solve it with AI, if you want to spend less, how much worse performance are you going to allow? And those trade-offs are very difficult to get a handle on with the kind of standard toolkit of what's available publicly.
Yeah, and Andy's referring there to the Institute for Government's tracker, which is good and worth a look. And I think one of the things we said when we put this work out this morning is that one reason I'd like to get away from the hamster wheel or the Groundhog Day or whatever you want to call it is that we have these debates about these big long-run challenges that are not just about how much money you spend, but what the state is trying to do, what it wants to deliver. I mean, the answer sort of mechanically can't just be we always spend more money. You'd soon just be spending the entire economy on the estate. It has to be about what choices and about how to be more productive as we go forward. So very much hope we get there. We probably have time to squeeze in one more question from the room. Has anyone got a question they would like to ask? If not, I'll go to the online questions. This one in the back middle there. Thank you. Thanks, Victor.
Richard Davis, an independent consultant. Perhaps just building on some of those thoughts that if there is going to be some increase needed in public expenditure as a whole, for the reason that Jonathan was touching on, I think some of the other panelists did as well. I wonder, we understand that obviously the scope to change all the headline tax rates is strictly limited by the manifesto commitments and so on. But does the panel think that the scope in this budget statement to give some sense of where the government might want to get to in the medium term on the tax position? What kinds of taxes it thinks it ought to prioritise, ought to be considered for further changes? This is one thing that, thinking back through my own institutional memory, I think it was the John Major to Gordon Brown period. There was actually quite a lot of sensible expectations development going on about environmental taxes, the role of capital taxes, the role of taxes on land. Do you see there's scope to do more of that now, even though it's not going to be for immediate implementation?
Great, thank you. I talk incessantly about visions for the tax system, and I promise I didn't plant that question. Does anybody else, before I say anything, does anybody else want to talk, comment on, like, the setting out where the government might go on tax or other things?
Can I say one thing, which is it relates to a lot of the material in the chapter and discussion about bond markets and so on. I think one key word is signal, right? It's about sending signals about what you plan to do and about your credibility and that you're serious and you understand the difficulty of the position we're in and you're going to do something properly about it. And Andy was saying about where's all these grand reviews of the property tax system? When we get some grandee to review the property tax system, what we should do next, set a medium-term direction, or we recognise the triple lock isn't sustainable in the long term. We promise this Parliament. In the long term, we need something to replace it. I'm going to get some luminary to go and decide what that should look like. Could be the IFS. But you know what I mean? There are things you can do that send a direction of travel and signal your intent that don't actually have to mean measures that go into the finance bill this autumn.
Right. Jonathan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, a very quick organisational point. If I may, look, I defer to the IFS and other people about the sort of medium-term orientation of the tax system. Let me make a kind of an organisational point. Jack and I used to work at the Bank of England. In the years that we were working there was just endless crises all the time, Brexit, the pandemic, Ukraine and all of that. You just never had, or I just never had, I shouldn't speak for others, I just never had the bandwidth to think about these more medium-term questions. So I think it takes you back to, if we're going to have the endless hamster wheel and the Groundhog Day and all of that, the government will never have the bandwidth to think about those medium-term questions. It's another reason, I think, to try to solve this problem right now.
Before I draw this to a close, Andy or Jack, do you want to say any final words? No. Great. Okay, in that case, let me say thank you, all of you, for coming. Thank you to everyone who's watching us online. Thank you to all of the wonderful speakers, especially to Jack, Jonathan and Andy. And huge thanks to my wonderful colleagues who, behind the scenes, really do a humongous amount of work across summer to make this book possible. And that's not just all the economists, that's also our wonderful comms team. So thank you to everyone who made this possible. And then one final, we've got the court members in the room who are staying for a briefing with us. If you stay where you are, and then we'll move to that next. But for now, thank you. And I hope we don't see you in 6 months. I hope we do get off out of Groundhog Day. But if we don't, then we'll be back. But thank you very much.